the last few months, the coronavirus has shaken the foundation of our worlds, and our lives, our communities, and our cities have all changed, perhaps forever. So cities have borne the brunt of the impacts, and they're also at the forefront of dealing with the fallout. In London, where I am, and around the world, cities are responding, innovating, and learning to this unprecedented crisis. But what should cities be doing to ensure that this recovery is green, and how can donors and the MDB community help? So these are the questions we're going to address today. My name is Nigel Jolins. I'm at the EBRD. I co-lead the EBRD Green Cities program now of €2 billion was just approved yesterday at the EBRD board, an extension, and we cover 43 cities to date. So I'm joined today by people who are at the forefront of climate action, climate finance, and the city response to this current crisis. Barbara Bruckner, Charles Reed Anderson, Lisa De Silva, and Cyril Arnaud. We'll introduce them shortly. Before I do that, I just want to go through a couple of things for the audience. First of all, a little bit of background about the climate investment funds, or the CIF as they're known. They're an $8 billion fund that for over a decade has been offering investment and advisory finance for clean energy, sustainable transport, resilience, forestry activities globally, and they do that through 6 multilateral banks: the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, EBRD, where I am, the Inter-American Development Bank, IFC, and the World Bank. So the CIF governing board has recently approved 4 investment programs around renewable energy integration, industrial decarbonization, smart cities, and nature-based solutions. So hence the focus on smart cities today as part of the Building Blocks series, part of London Climate Action Week. So for your information, CIF's hosted already 2 other sessions on clean energy transition and scaling up climate finance through financial intermediation. They have another session, I think the same time as this tomorrow, where my colleague Dimitri Koufos will be also participating. Now, a couple of logistics before we get into the webinar. First of all, we are recording this, so please be aware of that, and the recording will be made available to participants afterwards. The discussion is going to end with some Q&A, and the Q&A will be managed through the chat function. If you can please select Wei Ting Li, our colleague who is managing the chat function, and send questions to her, that would be great. And if you also want to use your social media, you can hashtag Building Blocks and tag it with @CIFActions. Okay, now over to the speakers. Each speaker is going to have 10 minutes, followed by a Q&A. So first of all, we're going to have some introductory remarks from Barbara Bruckner. Barbara is the Global Managing Director at the CPI, Climate Policy Initiative. She's named as one of 20 most influential women in climate change and advises leaders on climate, energy, land use investments around the world. She directs CPI's Cities Climate Leadership Alliance and the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, amongst many other responsibilities, including her advisory board roles on the BCFN, Valuation Board for the WEF, and so on. Now, I asked each of the speakers to give me a personal vignette on how they're coping with the global crisis, and she has mentioned that the difficulty or the challenge during this pandemic is to work out through the gap between home and work. So this gap between home and work kind of disappears, and she seems to be doing webinars 24/7, attested to the fact that it's, 5 a.m. Western Pacific time in the US. So Barbara, I hope you're awake with your hot tea. Over to you for some introductory remarks. You have 10 minutes. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nigel. It's a great honor to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this session today. Yes, as you said, my name is Barbara Bruckner. I'm the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative, and for over 10 years, my organization has helped governments, businesses, and financial institutions drive economic growth while addressing climate change, recognizing really the importance of multi-stakeholder approaches as the key ingredient. Since 2019, as you said, Nigel, we have also held the Secretariat for the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, allowing us to develop a greater focus on cities in this context. And based on what we are learning right now on this cities finance over the last few years, let me just start off by saying that this session couldn't be more needed right now. We know that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, subnational governments struggled to access climate finance to promote the needed green transition at the local level. And over this past year, as the pandemic has spread across the world, we have seen cities' fiscal health and capacity being even further tested. So let me go a little bit deeper into this overarching issue first. I think what we're seeing is that urban areas are experiencing the worst of the pandemic, facing both the health and economic crisis. Cities governments have seen drastically lower tax and other budget revenues alongside increased spending on healthcare and social protection. And as a result, many cities are putting capital expenditures on hold indefinitely, and in some cases shifting their long-term capital spending to immediate operational needs, which could lead to an even greater infrastructure deficit down the road. The fiscal imbalance caused by the pandemic will have lasting effects on cities, and particularly on their ability to recover in green, resilient, and smart ways. And this raises the importance of multi-stakeholder approaches to supporting cities, and particularly their ability to access finance. Certainly, cities cannot and should not shoulder the burden alone. They will rely on national governments, on development finance institutions, and on private sector finance to bounce back. And this also raises the importance of embedding principles for a green transition and recovery with necessary direction and leadership coming from national, regional, and local governments. But there are challenges ahead. We believe that with a strong multi-stakeholder approach, recovery and green transition can be shaped as an opportunity. And so what I'd like to do now is really look a little bit on how to do that. And let me start with the work that we're doing at the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. And through this alliance, we really aim to provide a platform to bring together relevant players who can together support cities through these difficult circumstances. Just for those who aren't familiar with the alliance, it serves as the multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for urban and subnational climate projects and infrastructure worldwide. All of the work that we are doing is member-driven and really aims to support and enhance the great work that our members are doing already. And in fact, our members are the backbone of the alliance. We are including more than 60 public and private financial institutions, governments, international organizations, NGOs, research groups, and city networks that represent most of the world's largest cities. And by taking part in the alliance and by contributing their expertise, their access to networks and their funding, these leaders really have committed to work together to bridge the supply and demand for sustainable and resilient development at the subnational level. The Alliance will provide a platform to convene and to exchange knowledge among all relevant actors dedicated to urban development, dedicated to climate action, and dedicated to financing in this context. So, for example, currently we are aiming to increase awareness of the need to prioritize the financing of sustainable infrastructure in cities as a key component of recovery funds, particularly by fostering a dialogue with national governments and capital providers. But let me move on a little bit and lay a little bit the scene on where we stand with overall climate investments and then specifically with investments towards cities. And so let me first provide a quick update of where we are in terms of international climate finance flows. And at CPI, we've indeed been tracking investment into climate action since 2011. And our latest edition from our global landscape of climate finance found that annual tracked climate finance in 2017 and 2018 crossed for the first time the $500 billion mark. And this is good news that reflects steady increases across all types of investors. But while we have this somewhat good news, we know that we're still falling far short of what is needed in order to achieve global climate and sustainable development goals. And in fact, in terms of subnational finance, there is a massive gap between the investment needs of the current and future urban infrastructure development and actual investment. So in partnership with the World Bank, we're currently working on an update to the State of Cities Climate Finance Report that will track urban-related city investment and will be released in early 2021. But again, just for this conversation today, already today we know from past research that cities really do not have and do not receive nearly sufficient climate finance. But let me focus a little bit on the opportunity, and the opportunity clearly is here. We know that globally low carbon resilient growth could deliver economic benefits of up to $26 trillion from now until 2013, and that's a conservative estimate. So if there's the money, the question obviously is how can it be accessible to cities? And here I think what I'd like to share with you a little bit more is that leveraging external capital such as private sector finance is essential, as the need for investment in climate-friendly infrastructure is far greater than what is available through traditional public sources. But for that to happen, some improvements must be made, and I'd like to share with you 3 of them. The first one, because of national regulations, a lot of cities legally cannot have access to private funds. So for climate finance to reach cities, national governments must work with cities on solutions for how private finance can be most effectively used. So land value capture and public-private partnerships are good examples of this, but cities need more. Second, national and subnational fiscal and institutional frameworks must be refined to improve project bankability. The ability of municipalities to attract private finance will really depend on the revenue sources to which they have access to cover financing costs. So improving such frameworks will really help cities to improve their public source revenue, but also to advance access to private investment. And lastly, I think I want to come to a point that's really important to me, which is data and transparency. So improving the quality of city financial data and management systems is essential to private investors. So in order to make investment decisions, what we hear is that investors really need to be able to understand municipal accounts and balance sheets and have confidence in the overall quality of financial management systems. And if you just put that in a more project-related scenario, the feasibility and quality of the projects in which private funds will be invested are directly relevant. So a good option for cities here is to really work with project preparation facilities, and there is a number of them like the C40, CIF, or Felicity, or ICLA-STAP, amongst others. And there are important tools for assisting cities in solving these constraints. And that's also one of the key areas we are focused on with our alliance via the project preparation action group that we run. But before closing, I'd just like to highlight a few other ways that the Alliance, but also CPI more broadly, are working to help close the subnational climate finance gap. And the first area here, again, and I just referred to that, again, it's really important to me, is better transparency and information. So as I've mentioned before, most cities, especially in developing countries, face challenges in identifying and developing financially viable low-carbon and climate-resilient infrastructure projects, which are at the same time attractive to public and private financiers. And so in this context, what we've done is we've recently launched a Green City Finance Directory, which is an online resource aimed to help subnational governments and stakeholders identify project preparation facilities that can support them in developing green and resilient infrastructure. If you're interested, you can share them. We can share the link in the chat functions here. It's at greencityfinance.org. The second point I want to mention is what really is needed in order to help us advance towards our goals is ambitious frameworks and accountability. So another example that I want to mention in that context is the Leadership for Urban Climate Investment, or LUCI initiative, which is a framework that elevates and tracks commitments made by the Alliance member initiatives. And each initiative mobilizes key stakeholders to build an effective and efficient framework that targets specific gaps along the value chain, linking initiatives that support projects from upstream concept to downstream finance-ready implementable infrastructure. And the one initiative I want to call out here is the new City Climate Finance Gap Fund, which is a central initiative of LUCI, which is the first global fund dedicated to supporting cities in the very early stage of project development with an aim to unlock 4 billion euros of investment, and we'll hear more about that later from Cyril from EIB. And then the third area I just want to close on is innovative business models and financial solutions that really can accelerate and unlock private investment. And private investment is critical if we want to get to the scale that's needed. So I'd like really to highlight as my last point here, one example of how to come up with innovative solutions that attract private capital incubators and accelerators. And one of them is the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which CPI manages since 2014. So just very briefly, what is the lab? The lab is a public-private initiative of experts in sustainable investment from governments, from development finance institutions, investment banks, institutional investors, and other private sector institutions. And its goal is to unlock private investment at scale for low-carbon resilient development. How does it do that? Well, it crowdsources, so it finds, it develops, and ultimately it supports the launch of new solutions that can tackle barriers and really attract investment. And since the lab started in 2014, it has developed and launched almost 50 financial instruments and business models. It's actually 49 to be very clear here and articulate. And these instruments and business models have collectively mobilized more than $2.2 billion for concrete projects in emerging markets, and many of them actually relevant in the urban context. And so the two examples I want to just mention briefly before closing is the first one is from our most recent 2020 lab cycle, which is the Subnational Climate Finance Initiative, which is expected to be the first private equity fund to feature a technical assistance facility that provides local government capacity building and certifies all projects for SDG impact prior to investment. So this facility uses a blended investment vehicle and also adds several new features that make mid-sized infrastructure projects more attractive for investment. And very pleased to say that just last week, the Green Climate Fund announced $150 million in funding for this instrument. And the second lab instrument that I'm going to mention, and then I promise, I will close. But I think it's an important one because it starts from the premise that addressing air pollution in cities saves lives. It avoids future health costs. It builds future human capital and the tax base, and all that while also addressing climate change. So the Breathe Better Bond Initiative, which is developed by the IFC, is an innovative bond issued by local governments in developing countries, which is paired again with technical assistances. And the proceeds here are used to invest in projects that both reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And again, I think it's really important to think about what are the concrete initiatives that we can use in order to scale investments into the urban space. So just let me conclude that I think we all know that the pandemic is a wake-up call, that our cities must be better prepared for the climate crisis that will be bigger in every way and stay with us over a much longer period of time. And so in order to build back stronger after COVID, we need to respond as the international community in a manner that lays the foundation for long-term green, resilient and inclusive growth. And I very much look forward to hearing from my co-panelists here and from everyone in the audience and how we can do that and how can we really join forces in order to accelerate and to go from the good pilots that we've seen to more comprehensive and holistic action here. And with that, let me hand back to you, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Amazing. It was like drinking from a fire hose listening to you talk. So much information. I've made some notes here.
Sorry,
things
like, that's 5 a.m.
No, but lots of information. This whole point about city access to finance, absolutely critical. And then your emphasis on the multi-stakeholder approach, the importance of involving national governments in this conversation around city access to finance. And then your mention of all of those really important initiatives, everything from Lucy through to the Innovation Lab. Fantastic. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do now is turn to Charles Reed Anderson. Charles is the founder of the CRA and Associates based in Singapore. He's one of Asia's leading technology industry innovators and thought leaders, and he's got an in-depth knowledge of emerging technologies and an understanding of the market demand. So he's able to separate industry hype from reality is his pitch. Now, interesting, when I asked the panelists about their little personal vignettes, how they're dealing with lockdown, Charles said that he's been working from home for about 20 years. So the situation shouldn't be any different, but he says it is because he used to meet clients and go for walking between buildings and walking between offices, and now he doesn't do that. And he's saying that his muscles are, he even used the word atrophied. So he's had to insert walks into his calendar to get back in shape. I guess many of us can relate to that. The other thing he's mentioned about the sort of desk-related injuries from being in their home desks all day. Anyway, I'm sure all of us can relate to what Charles has said there. So Charles, you've got a background in technology and its application to cities. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the accelerated digitalization in the world, how have cities managed this transition, and what more can they do in order to deliver a transformative shift towards low carbon, climate resilient urban areas? Charles, over to you. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, I want to start off by saying I wasn't completely lazy. I was still cycling. But the problem was, instead of reaching my 10,000 step a day target, I was probably hitting 10,000 steps to for a month, because that's how far it was to the coffee machine. But you missed out on that extra walking. So it's a little bit difficult, but we've gotten through it. So I'm now combining walking and cycling. But anyway, that's not what everybody wants to hear about. What we're going to talk about is what's going on with cities right now. And this is going to sound strange when I say it, but this has probably been one of the best things that could have happened to cities right now, because for years we've been talking about smart cities and nothing has actually changed. It's been overhyped. And the fact is, cities have still been far too bureaucratic in the way they're thinking. They haven't had a compelling event to make them act. And what's happening is, once they got over the initial hurdle of realizing, okay, we have to address this, it's got everybody thinking about where should we be going forward from here. And the good part is that we'll eventually start looking at a lot more of the green and sustainable issues around it. But in the meantime, what you have is every city in the world is trying to solve a problem of how do we make offices, government buildings, public locations safe and secure for people to go back into. And that creates huge opportunities, because we need technology to do that, whether it's things that do thermal imaging or cameras that can do measure social distancing. It allows for a lot of different solutions to come in. So that's the first wave we're seeing right now. And what's happening, unfortunately, a lot is everyone's panic buying, and they're not doing it strategically. So what's happening is they're buying a bunch of new platforms, new solutions that they have no idea how they're going to manage. But what's going to start coming up very soon, and which I'm very optimistic about, is now people in cities, because of their budget shortfalls, are going to say, how do I save money? And one of the easiest ways that cities know about how to save money is by improving their energy efficiency of how they operate their buildings. And all governments have tons of buildings. Now, these solutions aren't new. They've been around, but nobody really had the impetus to go out there and try and implement them. And what's happening now is people need to. And the market demand, if you're a technology vendor, isn't just, oh, I have to wait for this city to be ready. Everyone's basically going to be ready. So the market demand side is actually picked up. So I'm very optimistic about where cities are going to be going on this. There are certain cities I know about, like one in Australia in particular. Their smart cities budget is going to quadruple next year. So that's going to be quite interesting to see how what they're going to spend on. What we're also looking at in Asia in particular is what's going to happen about green and sustainability regulations. And this has been very lax, I would say, across Asia. If you look at Europe, if you look at Australia, for green building regulations, they're best practice basically about what you could implement. We haven't had those here, and that's held back the industry. It holds back from the investors wanting to invest in new technology because they don't see the premium coming out. But what I want to do is share one slide that I think will sort of explain the challenge that we face, because I like the idea that we're going to be putting in new regulations that are going to try and encourage the market to move forward. I like the fact that we're pulling together new funds to help invest, but that doesn't solve the problem yet, because there's actually this whole ecosystem we need to navigate. So if you could please pull up the slide. Okay, well, while we wait for the slide, I'll explain it, like the beginning part of it. What we're trying to do actually isn't rocket science. We're literally just trying to leverage technology to solve a problem. So that could be about carbon emissions. It could be about energy efficiency. It could be about, driving clean energy or clean water. And when you leverage those technology enablers on the far right, it should be simple. The problem is when you mix in supply and demand, which is this middle section of tens of thousands of entities. And let me explain why I think this is so complex, because I work a lot with some of the startups that have great solutions, but they're not successful. Because if you're a startup and say I want to create a new solution to help buildings become more energy efficient, how do I take that to a city? Because when I go to a city, do I talk to the smart city team? Or do I have to go and talk to one of the 30 or so government agencies they have? Or does the city make decisions centrally, or do they break it down by districts? So you end up having to talk to all these different groups for one single city. And then, of course, if you want to do a proof of concept, cities, for the most part, are very poorly set up to deliver a proof of concept and pilots. Normally it takes, Singapore can take 2 to 3 years for a proof of concept or a pilot. And we're viewed as best of breed for doing smart city initiatives. So this ecosystem doesn't work from that side. So the startups then can go to the technology vendors, but they tend to abuse these small little startups anyway. So it's a little difficult for them. So the problem is these ecosystems, they don't actually navigate together because everybody sits in silos. Cities think that they know best, so they don't really work that much with technology vendors because they think technology vendors only want to build them a bunch of expenses. Startups get abused by pretty much the whole ecosystem. So even though they're the ones driving the innovation, it's not going all the way through. So what we need to start doing is driving more cross-ecosystem collaboration. So if you hit it forward a couple times, we'll just get to the end of this one and I can explain it. When you start doing things like and putting regulatory regulations across the top, say it's for something about sustainability, carbon emissions, whatever it is, that creates a spark that then the investment community knows where it's going. And then you need the rest of this ecosystem to start getting together and figuring out how they do this. The problem we have today is it doesn't work efficiently because supply and demand don't really come together. So an example of this would be if you look at Asean Smart Cities Network. So I believe that's about 26 cities across ASEAN, but it's just the cities coming together talking about best practice. On the technology vendor side, you've got so many different vendor partnerships from the PATH initiative in China, which is Ping An, Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei, or like there's a new one in Australia with Telstra working together with Microsoft. The technology vendors coming together. What you need is these groupings to come together in more PPPs and trying to figure out what is best practice, how do we implement it, how do we share that going out. There are some examples that I'm tracking closely on this to see how we can solve it. One of them is Stanford University is partnering with the city of Incheon in Korea, and they get access to all the data that is captured from Incheon, which means they can look for ways to drive operational efficiencies, identify new revenue streams, basically just create new business models that they wouldn't be able to do on their own. So that type of partnership involving higher education gets very interesting. There's also a couple of other ones. Out of Europe now, you're getting the Urban Technology Alliance, which is bringing together vendors and cities. And this is a global one. So it's based out of Europe, but they're partnering with cities in Japan, Taiwan, Korea as well, to basically create these test beds where you can basically put in a call for solutions saying we want to solve this type of initiative or this type of a challenge, and giving people a test bed for cities to go and share that, show that it can be delivered, prove the ROI, and then take it out to market. And there's another one, which is a plug because I'm actually on the advisory board of, which is the Global Organization of Smart Cities. And that's 425 cities and technology vendors that share best practice and drive intercity proof of concepts. And what's great is if someone does a proof of concept in there, it gets shared out. So regulations are important, investment is important. What we need is to solve the problem that actually sits underneath it inside of this ecosystem. So how do we get them talking together? How do we get them sharing best practice? Cities should not be starting out with a blank piece of paper going, what am I going to do for sustainability? They're driving green initiatives. There should be things and models they should be leveraging going forward on that. But I don't want to ramble on too long about that in case anybody has a question or not, or in case Nigel has something you'd like to add on it. But it's a very complex problem. We need to break down these silos, and we need to get people to actually come together and sit around a table to try and solve these issues and move the industry forward.
Charles, fantastic. I've got a couple of points that you've made note. This idea of panic buying of solutions, something that we've experienced in the countries of operation where I work in the EBRD. I wouldn't say panic buying, but it's basically liquidity support. There's all this effort going into keeping these companies and cities liquid, and they're using it to buy, and it is panic buying, I guess, equipment, for example, medical equipment, without any consideration for the energy efficiency of this equipment, right? I mean, billions is going out the door in quick succession to keep people alive. For what examples have you seen? We've got a couple of minutes before we move on to Lisa. What examples, what's the best example of what you've seen of a city working not in a panic mode, but in a considered mode? Or is there no example?
The things I really like are some of the things that went on behind the scenes. Maybe the ones you don't hear about as much, but it's like where people would leverage lockdowns to put in more bicycle lanes. And it's something like that means someone behind the scenes is thinking strategically, going, wait a minute, okay, we have this problem, but this creates opportunities. And that's what I like to see is when cities actually look at this pragmatically. We're in a bad situation, but that means there's ways we should be rethinking everything we do. And that's what I like to see. And this is what happens in times of crises. People do reevaluate all their business operational models about how can we do these things better. And if it's about, social distancing and, do we want people in public transport? We'll give them better bike lanes. So let's leverage that. What we're also seeing in Asia is people are a lot more responsible here, but then the governments have been trying to I would say encourage them even more to be more socially responsible. It's worked relatively well. But the model that I think was the best with it was the big challenge is things around contact tracing. What can you do, and what is the ethical use of data? Because of GDPR, that's a real risk going across Europe in particular. What I'm tracking now is to see which governments are going to be coming out with code of ethics around AI. Singapore's IMDA, which is the telecoms regulator, just released an AI governance framework around this. That becomes interesting. I like Korea's model where they had something in the legislation that if an emergency like SARS from before ever arose, they could access certain amounts of data. I want to see how they're going to be evolving legislation for what happens for the next pandemic, or in the unfortunate event that this one goes on a lot longer. So those are the things I like to see when people are looking at problems and solving problems and not just doing the panic buying.
Fascinating, interesting examples, Charles. In my own neighborhood, the local authority has removed 1/3 of the road space in the whole of the neighborhood and turned it into cycle lanes, permanent cycle lanes, much to the consternation of the motorists, I might point out. Charles, thanks very much. Some really interesting examples there from kind of on the ground stuff that's really happening. That was fantastic. So now I'd like to move to Lisa. Lisa Da Silva is a Principal Investment Officer in IFC's Global Upstream Department and IFC's Global Cities Lead. As Global Cities Lead, Lisa is responsible for identifying emerging trends impacting cities and drawing from across IFC's global and regional industry teams to develop solutions to those challenges. She's been at the forefront of establishing solutions for a long time, including IFC's climate business, blended finance, climate cities practice, and upstream businesses. And again, a little personal vignette from Lisa is that she actually enjoys working from home and having her older teenage children around her, but same theme that Charles and Barbara have mentioned, this divide between work and home gets blurred, and finding time to do exercise. I think it's a common theme across all of us. So Lisa, as the Global Cities Lead at IFC, you're acutely aware of the challenges that cities face. And despite the innovations in the digital solutions that Charles has highlighted, upstream issues in the form of regulation still hold cities back from climate action. What do you think are the main barriers, and what has been IFC's experience in tackling these issues head on? Lisa, over to you. You got 10 minutes.
Thanks, Nigel. I will note that I was one of the lucky ones that actually was involved in the CIFs, and I think it's a great program. And yes, as cities lead, I certainly am not thinking about everything, but definitely managing some of the coordination in this smart city space is really important. I love coming after Barbara and Charles because they really set the context. And so I will just summarize that we're at a point where subnational revenues post-COVID are really have declined. The bank estimates a decline in 15 to 25% of revenues, and that changes depending on region. That this pandemic is going to push 71 million people into extreme poverty just in 2020 alone. And if you look at the uncertainty on the economic recovery of some of these cities, it's become challenging because private sector interventions, the private sector is hesitating to come in. And so cities are going to have to learn how to do more with less funding. And I think digital solutions are going to play an important part in that, as both of our previous speakers have mentioned. In the IFC context, our cities have been demanding support in things like health, education, and transport in recent months. Now, I wanted to really emphasize what Charles said. This coordination issue is going to be really important, both within our city's clients and between the departments within the our city's clients, and even among us as a development community. And that's kind of where I would like to ultimately get. We've seen that our city's clients starting at a different point in time. So, for example, I love that the city of Bogota told us that when the Pope came to speak in Bogota and the security department wanted data on transport flow, they could, establish a secure path for the Pope, they could not access that data because from a regulatory point of view, they couldn't even share data among their own city departments, right? Mexico, on the other hand, has a data center and a very sophisticated way of sharing data and utilizing their data for different programs. And the whole establishment of smart cities and being able to unlock actual solutions does require a lot of layers and complexity and interrelated interventions. So, just to start, you do need the digital infrastructure, and you need access to that digital infrastructure. You need digital platforms to be able to analyze your data. You need the regulations that allow the use of that data, as Charles talked about, and you need skills. People need to be able to use the information that they have. I find it quite interesting that 42% of people are within range of mobile broadband signals, but they don't use it, and largely because of digital literacy and affordability of mobile devices, and that's important. And then there's a couple of, even when you have that base platform, you need some essential drivers, right? So mobile penetration being one of those, if we're going to try and increase access, open data platforms that enable citizens and companies to be able to use the data and develop solutions, and digital financial services. So if you're able to have digital financial services, that unlocks opportunities for a lot of SMEs and small businesses. It allows you to pay your bills and conduct a lot of commerce. And so all of these things have big impacts and unlock a lot of things. And then you also have the digital solutions and things like smart traffic management systems, right? These things also require, there's one element is how do you have broad access and expand the reach of your digital infrastructure? The other one is the quality of the infrastructure. So depending on the speed and the sophistication of the technology, that's going to impact what kinds of solutions you can have. If you were able to expand digital infrastructure, you could, or that is necessary to enable telehealth services or teleeducation. And these are things that are going to be important post-COVID. I think, as Charles noted, cities are going to be looking at ways of reducing costs, increasing access to service delivery, becoming more efficient. So all of these things are going to be essential as we look at a post-COVID recovery. And so if you look at what do cities need from us as a development community, I think they need help in understanding how digital solutions can help them achieve their urban goals. How can it help create access to services? How can it help improve efficiency? How can it help create jobs and bring green solutions? They need help in developing a roadmap. And when I say a roadmap, I mean that includes what projects, what regulatory and policy interventions, what kind of sequencing do you need to be able to unlock that? And then how do they finance them, right? And I think as a development community, there's a really important role for us to play in helping cities develop those roadmaps, in helping, in becoming a trusted partner in both among ourselves and each other, in terms of none of us as a development community cover all of the aspects, right? And I don't think that it would be smart to assume that we should. So how do we look at who can engage on the policy front? How do we develop some of the upstream work to unlock certain trajectories, and how do we invest today? So I think that we need to help cities manage the crisis in the short term, right? So one of the big challenges that we've seen is city finances have shifted from capital investments into these short-term needs. I've got to pay for the PPE equipment. I've got to, hospital beds. I've got, economic just protection plans for citizens because they've lost their jobs. And so capital investments are at risk. So how do we in the short term help cities manage through to contain basic essential services? From an IFC perspective, our short-term focus has been on helping cities maintain the continuation of basic essential services. So in Turkey, we're working with the water utility to ensure the continuation of construction in water expansion. In the city of Zaporizhia, we're helping the city with digital solutions, and this is advisory services, so that they can track the movement of people in a private way, let's say, without names, and so that the city can make better decisions on where to put their funding. And because we see everybody's headed to these parks, these churches. This community is going to need more resources, and we're helping Morocco with their expenses in terms of just being able to manage purchases of emergency equipment. I think in the longer term and medium and longer term, we're tackling two things. On the financing front, we are looking at creative ways to support cities. And I think in the medium term, we can expect that the private sector is going to hesitate. And I've had people ask, we've put out PPPs and there isn't the same kind of traction. And I would say that those PPPs were probably structured pre-COVID and coming out into the market today. And the private sector doesn't necessarily know all the time what is an economic recovery going to look like? Is the credit worthy? If the subnational is my off-taker, are they going to be credit worthy? Are they going to be credit worthy? They're hesitating on whether their contracts are going to be respected. And so I think that the support that we can give to cities in helping to manage some of that risk perception is going to be important in the medium term. I think that the risk allocation between public and private sector in the short term may need to shift as well. Guarantees, et cetera, are going to be important. We are exploring ways of things like creating asset management companies for cities where some of these smaller investments may be able to be packaged into a larger investment that then is more attractive to certain private investors or even the MDB community. I think a lot of us are not built to finance small interventions. And then, so on the final, am I at time?
You're at time, but we've got one of the other panelists really wants to ask you a question.
Okay.
So I didn't want to interrupt.
I was going to end here anyway. I mean, I did want to just note that we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we are exploring different financing solutions and being creative in hybrid PPPs, where the financing of projects may be a mix of public and private sector. And then the last thing I will just say is, in addition to the financing, we have a whole upstream business line, and we're looking at how do we roll out these roadmaps, and how do we do things like expanding broadband connectivity through sewer lines? Like, how do we roll that out and learn from one country to another? So let me stop there.
Brilliant.
Happy to take questions.
So thanks very much. Well,
I just wanted to add one comment on that.
Yeah, so Charles, please, over to you.
Okay, so like you really raised a good point there about the CapEx issue, and cities are going to struggle in the coming years around CapEx. But the good news is, if you're looking at things that help create green, smart, and resilient cities, it isn't always about CapEx. So like what I was talking about with those smart building solutions and increasing energy efficiency, it's not CapEx. It's not about installing new pieces of equipment. It's leveraging existing sensors that sit inside the buildings and the existing building management systems that are already there. And it's taking data that we already have and turning it into actionable intelligence. So that's a software as a service model, which goes to your complete OpEx play. And then you also mentioned as well about the idea about creating, dealing with traffic data. That's a great way to start improving resilience for city, and also for improving mobility. And what you can do is leverage something like what Alibaba's been doing with their City Brain solution. So they launched it first in Hangzhou, and now they're in 23 cities. And what they've been able to do is basically take existing data sources. So taxis, they know where the taxis and buses are. They have cameras on streetlights, so they know where people are moving. Any sensors that they had in the city, they combined all these different data sources that already existed, and that gave them the intelligence to understand, okay, well, this is how the traffic's moving. This is how we can then start changing the streetlights and all that and moving it around. So it becomes quite a great way of doing it, because these are things that cities can do that aren't CapEx intensive. So it's great to give them money. They don't always spend it well anyway. Why don't we look for also ways that they can just deliver things that leverage their existing assets and take data that they already have and turn it into intelligence? So sorry, I'm a little rant on that one. I'll hand back over.
No, Charles, I love that point. And I do, because to me, that is the point of a roadmap and sequencing, because I think there are a lot of interventions that can be done immediately. And you just gave a number of those examples of things that can be done immediately. But I think what we want to do is, I think too often, even us as a development community, but people are looking at projects, individual projects. So if I'm working in healthcare and I'm looking at where can I roll out telehealth opportunities, well, that's going to be limited by where there is where the infrastructure goes, right? So my point is, the roadmap identifies what are the low-hanging fruit and interventions that can be done immediately, while thinking ahead about what sequence do you need and what regulatory interventions do you need to enable the further growth. So today you could be working on the policy side to lay the broadband, and maybe you need to tweak regulations to allow telehealth to happen, but it's the infrastructure that unlocks the healthcare type investments, or some of these other investments. And I think smart traffic management systems will require a certain quality of broadband as well. So The roadmap is about being thoughtful, which I think is what you said, and I couldn't agree more. And I will also
Thank you,
say
Lisa.
one other thing. I think that we need to start looking at things beyond just a project. So we financed upgrade of buses, for example, right? In Mariupol, we financed the upgrade of buses, but that in and of itself will create only a limited benefit. If you couple that with the smart traffic management system, it becomes a whole other intervention with improved benefits. And I think we need to start thinking in more
systemic
holistic
kind of impact.
Yeah, in integrated ways.
Yeah. Lisa, thanks so much. I'm sorry we have to push on. Some great ideas there. It looks like I get the sense I'm collecting main points from all the speakers, words that begin with the letter C. And I'll keep you all in suspense on the ones that I've come up with. But I'll give you a hint. One of them was cost reduction. There you go. Let's see if Cyril now can add to my collection of these main points beginning with the letter C. So Cyril Arnaud, our next speaker, is the head of the Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Fund at the European Investment Bank, and he's also the head of the Climate City Gap Fund. And prior to the EIB, Cyril worked at both the IFC and EBRD. When I asked him about how he's coping with the pandemic, he mentioned that for the last 25 years, he's been commuting to work by bicycle. So his exercise was built into his daily routine. Here we go, the same theme coming through. Who gave him a mental break between home and work. And now with the pandemic and being working from home, he's had to build that exercise back into his routine. He says he misses the human interactions that travel and face-to-face contact has made. And he made one point here that he's consoled by the fact that knowing his carbon footprint has shrunk, I imagine pretty considerably, given the amount of travel he was doing. Cyril, so the GREF facility, as it's known, was established to help channel finance into green urban infrastructure in emerging markets. And the EIB, along with the World Bank, has now launched this Climate City Gap Fund. How does it differ to the GREF? And how's it going to accelerate the flow of finance to cities for climate action? Cyril, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and glad to be here and listening to. I'm going to answer this question, but I have to say, listening to Barbara, Charles, and Lisa, and all the initiatives and ideas, where it's clear, to tackle climate, especially climate issues with cities, if I may say so, it will take a village, and you have quite a few examples here during the talk. Look, GREF, was set up in 2008, and basically with a very simple mission. It was to prove that the private sector could be brought to bear in developing countries, even frontier countries, to finance the development, construction, and therefore commissioning afterward of renewable energy infrastructures. 10 years down the road, it'd be too long here to explain the whole thing, but it happened. In fact, in collaboration often with, sometimes the IFC, BRD, of many of the other DFIs, but massive amounts of private capital. We have 200 some projects around the world, over 3 gigawatts of capacity brought online. And basically the answer to the question is fun. Yes, it can be done. We have maxed out the Uganda grid with renewables. So again, so we've scratched the surface, but I think we have answered a fundamental question we had. It can be done. We can find the capitals. We can find and develop the teams to do so. So it's basically we're putting more electrons in the grid, but we're not solving really some of the issues with the cities. And if you allow me, Nigel, to go back a little bit to my initial remark, of biking to work, and also how our thinking, has changed and still need to change. When I was with the IFC, I was biking to work, and one of the bottleneck was lockers. at the IFC new building on the 1818 Pennsylvania Avenue. Well, same thing with EIB. Well, after a few years at the EIB commissioned a brand new building, cutting edge in terms of energy efficiency, low energy building. It's a beautiful building. Before it was built, we were all brought in for a town hall meeting, and we were told how green and wonderful it was all going to be. Then I raised my hands, and plus they told us, everybody, don't worry, guys, everybody will have a parking spot, And I raised my hand and said, well, I'm not really interested in a parking spot, but I just like to have a permanent locker, because I need to change. Otherwise, I'm a mess. And as those who have been to Luxembourg know, it rains a lot in Luxembourg. And, I was looked at like I was some form of freak, a guy. Now, more than 10 years later, the EIB is planning the construction of a new building. And this time there will not be any parking space for cars, but, parking, for bicycles. And that goes along the lines of, I think what Barbara and Charles and Lisa said. New biking lanes have been installed over the last few weeks and months in major cities. I mean, go to Paris again. Paris is it's incredible. I mean, the main thoroughfares now are almost only for bicycles. But if we really want to build it into the hardwired into our lives, for example, all offices buildings will need to be equipped with some things as high tech as showers and lockers, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. In the long run. So just a little bit of anecdote on that point. And to also frame the City Gap Fund, which I will get to in a minute, I think it's important to explain that EIB week has adopted this climate bank roadmap. I mean, Lisa was alluding to the need for roadmaps, and EIB now has done it. It's basically, by 2025, 50% of our financing will be climate or sustainable environment, related. We're going to mobilize 1 trillion by 2030. And as of the 1st of January, 2021, let's just say it's tomorrow, every operations of EIB will be Paris aligned on 1.5 Celsius. So it's a major fundamental shift. One of the reasons where this is happening, and perhaps in the EU less so than in some other regions of the world or institutions, we're not trying to trade between COVID and climate. It's simply it's the political situation. All the election results, all the ballots counted in Europe over the last few years have clearly shown that green parties have been the winning ones. In France, in Germany, in all the key countries. And therefore, all the politicians, be they right, left, center, above and under, realize the way to go and for them to remain relevant politically is to support strong green agenda. And therefore, the European Commission, and EIB being part of the EU system, we just have no choice. So it's not COVID or climate, it's both of them together for us. Now, especially Lisa was very eloquently saying that it's to get cities climate resilient, to adapt, it's a very complex matter, and nobody has really done it. We're doing it as we, are learning how to do it in a way. We're, sewing our parachute as we jump. EIB has perhaps the advantage is, as most of you know, we were both the EU bank that used to say the significant part, 90% of our financing goes to the EU, but also we're a significant player outside of the EU. And within the EU, we have a long, experience dealing with sub-sovereigns, with the cities, with regions, etc., both on the public side and the private side. And therefore, this is giving us, a good learning ground to get a bit smarter what works, what doesn't work, and in which sequence should you do things. Now, turning to developing countries and EIB, because of Europe's history, it's outside of Europe. A key region is Africa for us. Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific countries, but Africa is really our main focus. We're active also in Asia and Latin America, but Africa is really a focal point for us. needless to say that when we want to engage with cities, or when African cities want to do something, they're confronted with two gaps: the gaps in human capital, and a gap in financing. And obviously, before having a financing plan, you need to have a plan. And this is why with the World Bank, we've come together, but it's not, it can be a menage of more than 2 or 3. The others will join. We have just launched the City Gap Fund. And the City Gap Fund is targeting low and middle income cities, and therefore countries, in providing the financial resources to put together those resilient plans, so they are not only coherent, but also can be financed. As we have already discussed, part of the financing may come from the private sector. I mean, the private sector is well equipped to run transportation systems, for example, but part of it is also pure public finance, sector, and how to strategize that, plan it, and organize it. It's no small task. And clearly, some African cities, and even those who are growing very quickly, need support and need help. So with the City Climate Finance Gap, we have also an African Sustainable Cities Initiative to particularly target them and help them. So what we're trying to do is provide financial and technical support for early stage project preparation, and also in parallel, strengthening municipal finances and developing funding models, that will support those plans.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we're really convinced that short of that, this is just not going to happen. There is kind of, I would say we're not turning to some post-Soviet planners, but we need to have a plan, for those cities. It cannot be improvised, otherwise it will be a mess. I've not looked at the clock, but maybe I should just stop here, and because I know there will be a Q&A session, and I don't want to get lost in the details.
Cyril, thank you very much. Just now checking the list of questions that we've got from the participants. I see we have one question. So what I'd like to do now is we'll come to the formal thanks to all of the panelists at the end, but thank you, preliminary thanks to all of you for your amazing insights into the issues that cities and climate action are facing. Let's now turn to the first question. We have, first of all, a question from the floor and then a question from one of our panelists. So the question from the floor is from Dean Sira. Did I say that correct? Apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Cities are experiencing massive fiscal constraints due to the economic impact of efforts to reduce the spread of COVID. This, waiting, can you please mute the other people, please? It's a bit distracting. Thank you. The economic impact of COVID is taking a lot of this fiscal pressure, and this is going to be exacerbated without the support, which is not coming in many places. How does this impact the efforts to pivot towards climate smart investment in the medium term? I'd like to suggest that we start this with Lisa. Lisa, could you please just offer us a few thoughts on this general question about the massive impact that the COVID's happening and the impact that that's having on the delivery investment, obviously through IFC and the other investment arms that you're familiar with. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks. I wish I had the answer completely, but what I will tell you is that we're seeing that all of our clients are still very committed to their climate commitments, and they're looking at a green recovery, and I think even they see it as an opportunity. And while I said before that capital investment plans will be stressed going forward, and that is true for many cities, there are some cities that are in fact taking this opportunity to expand and amend their capital investment plans going forward. So access and how to make it green. We've got a lot of our city clients that are coming to us and asking us, there are the electric buses. How do we, public transport is being disrupted right now. How do they recover and how do they put green elements into it? I think there are some cities, honestly, that are going to suffer because their finances will be low. They can't necessarily borrow. And it's going to be a challenge. That's where I say I don't have the answers for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. In some of our countries of operation, we've seen public transport that you just mentioned, their revenues plummet 90% this year. And so obviously their ability to invest in green solutions going forward is going to be curtailed. I think Barbara has a question. Barbara, are you there?
I'm here, yeah, and it's been fascinating listening to my co-panelists. Maybe just can I add on to this question as well, and then I'm asking my question. I think this is really for us also, like, I think we all need to help basically draw more attention that, cities need to have a bigger place in recovery plans. I mean, we've been looking as part of our work at, how many, we've seen that there's been massive and very swift kind of relief measures from governments, national governments, from DFIs, from private sector entities, but only 4% of those are going actually to cities. So I think we really need to kind of also voice the concerns a little bit more and step up and like try to influence, future recovery planning and really make sure that economic recovery, we all know it's not, the one that is socially just and environmentally sustainable is not only achievable, but also brings better outcomes. And there's data on that. So I just think it's such a big concern that I think we all need to be better and also kind of voicing our concerns here and trying to influence the next kind of wave of relief measures that's going to come. Again, this is something that can be good for cities, but can be good for the economy, can be good for the environment and for the people. So I think it's just something we got to do a better job. But the question I wanted to ask is actually to Cyril, and I think it's we have been as the Alliance working a lot also to support the GAP Fund, and I'm very excited about the latest announcement. But I think for the audience, it could be just good to explain a little bit more on how it's different from the range of existing project preparation facilities that are already kind of trying to help and support cities in accessing finance. Because again, I think it has a really specific niche and a really important niche. So I was just wondering, Cyril, if you can maybe give a little bit more, a better understanding of what's the GAP Fund specific kind of niche compared to other existing project preparation facilities. Back to you.
Thank you, Barbara. And Mother Katia, and you'll correct me if I miss it. I mean, first, it's really targeting low and middle income countries. I heard, Bogota, it's already, able to look after itself. It knows where and how to seek help. And so we're really looking at the ones who are the cities and in the countries who are the most vulnerable to the climate challenge. And it's really the early stage of project development. So how to organize, how to map out, understand which are the counterparts that will be involved, and how to address them, how to deal with them. So it's both, again, as I said, a planning exercise, and let's be clear, it's not something that's done over a few months. It's going to be a multi-year exercise. It's a journey that we're embarking with our partner cities. And then again, how to organize the financing. Maybe one of the challenge with the number of initiatives is that on the other side, people are overwhelmed. Institutions are overwhelmed. If you need to deal both with the CIF, the GCF, EIB, etc., it's too much. So the role also of the fund will be to it's not to handhold, it's not to be condescending, but to realize let's not reinvent the wheel. at every city level. Let's just put together methodologies. There'll be 2 or 3 maybe variants, and they will be able, we'll be able to replicate them, on a large scale. But Barbara, tell me if you were thinking about another point about the City Gap Fund. Please do let me know.
No, I think you captured it really well, Cyril. Again, I think for me the important thing is just that it's really the early stage, because I think it's very hard to I think there's a lot of project preparation facilities, again, for different types of cities and different geographies, but I think it's the level before. So I think it's really important to show that there is someone where some facility that cities can go to for their early stage planning. So I think that's a really important point to me.
Yeah, and again, it's also because this is what is daunting is, as we all know, to do it, you need to know about transportation, you need to know about water, you need to know about sewage, you need to know about city planning, and all those various parts. Each one of them is a complex bit of work. And so what's, EIB with the World Bank and our partners, we do, in-house, we have this collective experience. So we can, bring it to bear for our partner countries and cities. Is how all those moving parts move together, and that's, I think one of the fundamental point of why we put it together.
Thank you, Cyril, and thank you, Barbara, for that question. The questions are starting to come in now. We have a question from Lou at the CIF about the role of concessional finance in accelerating smart cities transition. And I'd like to pose this again to Lisa and then also ask Charles to intervene, because one of the concerns we have, of course, about concessional finance is that with MDBs having access to cheap money, it can potentially crowd out other private financing. And so there's this tension here about the need for concessional finance and potential crowding out. So first of all, to Lisa, what's the role of concessional finance in accelerating smart cities transition?
Thanks. I think that challenge and that risk has always been there in terms of, is blended finance going to crowd out private investors? But I don't think that's not the case, and there's a lot of things that are not happening. Look, if we take the example of adoption of electric vehicles, right, as one thing, it's been challenging, and it's been challenging for more than just the fact that there's this big upfront cost of electric buses. So let me take electric buses in a BRT system. I think the blended finance can help address those cost challenges. And then we also need to work on things like they tend to be very fragmented. The creditworthiness of the operators is challenging. So how can we develop systems that can help defray some of that upfront cost? I think it's going to be essential for the uptake of some of these applications. I see it looks like Cyril and Barbara also want to add maybe to that. So let me pass it to them for their thoughts too.
If I may start, I mean, first, I'm less concerned about crowding out than some other people. I think the point about blended finance, etc., it's not binary, one or the other. And my experience with GRF is very telling. Is to bring, private investors, into the fray. In a way, we all know we're big, clumsy, slow, bureaucratic organizations. The private sector, once they get the drift, they'll beat us at it. But more fundamentally, a lot of the project preparation, is not something that can be privately financed. It's too long. It's too costly. And this is where, going back to the high level, this is where developed countries need to step in. We have created the climate mess. And we're not talking huge amount of money. I mean, it's significant amounts. We know the bulk of the climate finance will need to come from the private sector, but to lay the groundwork, especially when we deal with municipalities, it behooves us to foot the bill. I don't know about a model where it could be privately financed, and I don't think we have time to go exploring for one.
Can I add to that, Nigel? I agree. I completely agree. I think it's interesting. So IFCs, we've implemented an entire new business line, or what we call our upstream business line. We've hired more than 260 people, and a lot of and the focus of that work is really how do we open markets? How do we enable projects, and how do we open markets? And of course, and when I say open markets, I mean open markets to the private sector. And of course, yes, IFC may finance some of them, but you're going to be enabling the entire private sector to be able to do that. And I agree with Cyril that it's a tricky space, but we as a development community need to kind of intervene and to open up those markets. And I think that donor support is going to be important for some of that, because there is a public good element to it if we're able to unlock some of the market.
Thank you. Okay, you've made some good points there about the finance gap being so large that it's difficult to crowd out private sector and the need to work together, private and public both in this space. I wonder if we can bring in Charles in this discussion. Charles, any thoughts from you on this, since you're coming from the private sector?
Yeah, I was looking at this, the end of that question about how do you bring in innovators and startups to scale. And this is where I think governments have made a lot of efforts, but they haven't been extremely successful. And I'll use Singapore as the example. We have between 140 and 150 incubators and accelerators in Singapore, and we have a population of about 5.5 million. And hardly any of those are delivering value. So governments are throwing money at these things, but we don't have an ecosystem. It isn't just about the money. We need to think about where that money goes and how do you help these startups scale. Because the challenge you have is, I mean, Singapore's a small market, so we give them a bunch of money to get going. But these startups, if they want to get to the next round of funding and scale and be successful, they need access to international markets, international cities, prove that they can scale internationally. And they just need to start building out these companies. The models aren't in place. The current model where we're putting these accelerators inside of just cities doesn't really work very well, and it hasn't been very successful. So there is some examples where it works, but not many. And the idea is we really need to take a look at what we're doing and provide a model where it's easy for a startup to just test a solution. Because let's face it, I mean, like I said, I work with some startups here. They were involved in a 3-year proof of concept that wasn't successful. So during that time, they had to get a bridge financing just to survive the 3 years of the government proof of concept, and it didn't work out. We need to find models for cities to create environments, whether they're going to be test hubs or labs, where they can go out and say, fine, in 3 to 6 months, you're going to test your solution. We'll see if it works. And it's got to be like an if-then statement. If you do this, then we will deploy. Cities don't do that right now. There's far too many proof of concepts and pilots that have no success metrics, no plan on what to do if it does work. It's just playing with toys for the most part. So they need to be much more strategic in how they handle that.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. And thanks also to Lisa and Cyril on the concessional finance element. Now, there's another question come in here, again from Lou from CIF. What are the policy actions that need to happen to bring innovators and startups to scale and application? I think this also leads on nicely from Charles's intervention about innovation. So I'd like to ask Barbara, please, could you have a go at offering your thoughts on this question? Thanks very much.
Sure, and it actually does lead very nicely from Charles, because I do think, I mean, and I'm going to address it a little bit from the experience that we have from basically, you know, best practices from the last years of climate funds and public-private efforts that are really more focused on, you know, how can we get entrepreneurs or innovators to scale, but by helping them to get access to finance and really have the right financial solutions. So I think I'd like to kind of come back to how can we get from the pilots like the ones that come out from our innovation lab, which, you know, again, with very small core support has helped mobilize more than 2.2 billion for specific financial instruments and actions. And in this way also has really helped entrepreneurs and incubators to do their pilots. But I think what we've learned from the lab is that the success in terms of commercial scale has just not been systemic. So really the problem is that the focus of many incubators is either, as Charles has said, on like really kind of testing models, go through all these test phases, but it's very often like in the lab, we have a focus on earlier stage financial solutions and the more difficult sectors, including across cities. So I think that's an important niche, but if we want to get to scale, then we really need to help these innovative business models and these financing solutions to get past the valley of death that they face after their initial concept development and after the initial pilot is complete. And what we find is that really funding to demonstrate the viability for commercial investment at scale is just very short in supply. So I think one of the thoughts that we have on how can we really get them to scale and how can we make sure that the solutions have the right funding is that we're working on a facility that we call the Paris Agreement Accelerator Fund, the PAF, which really aims to support these early stage projects and these innovators past such a valley of death and really unlock private investment. So it plans to do so by providing catalytic investment, which is patient, which is risk tolerant, into innovative, high impact, scalable financial solutions in the developing countries. Again, we have a specific stream on cities there. And the combination of early stage flexible capital and focused technical capacity can really help reduce lead time and transaction costs. And therefore, this combination of development support with commercially oriented investment, particularly for some of the wholesale approaches or aggregation platforms, where you bring together, the small scale initiatives across cities, rather than having individual retail transactions. I think this would really help in both creating the scale and also in diversifying risk and therefore ultimately attracting private capital on commercial terms at scale. And in this way, really helping innovators and entrepreneurs to get to the scale that they need. And so I think that's not fully answering her question, but I think this is at least kind of my perspective on how can we really make sure that we go from the many pilots, from the many small entrepreneurs to kind of some scale in this space. And back to you, Nigel.
Nigel, if I may.
Thank you, Barbara. Actually, Cyril, I think Lisa wants to step in, and then over to you, Cyril. So Lisa, first to you.
Sorry, thanks. I just wanted to add a quick, at a more basic level, even starting back, open data platforms and making data available is almost a requirement to kind of spur some of this innovation. And then with that comes the whole privacy on data. And I think it was mentioned by one of the speakers earlier, but we can't underemphasize the importance of, managing data privacy in all of this and the solutions that we're creating and scaling. So I just wanted to keep that in the conversation.
Good point. Good point. Thank you. And Cyril, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amusing because now I'm going to mention a very close to home experience, because in fact my son has a startup that has an application that is has been supported by through a public incubator. What have we learned so far? Public incubators can be great, but they're mostly run by people who have limited business experience, because true entrepreneurs, very few of them go into managing incubators, at least in Europe. And dealing with cities, and my son has an app which is making money, so I'm good, but it definitely could be applicable used by cities. The problem is that a startup and a city are culturally so far apart, and the regulations under which a city function are such that it makes connecting extremely challenging. Now, I think the way it's going to work is some of those big service companies that we have, privately run, private companies running, sewage, water, safety things for cities, are the ones who should be the vectors for those startups, because they're private companies and understand how it works. They also understand how to talk, contract, and work with cities. Startups are, they're brilliant people, but they cannot. It's really for them, to deal at the early stage with the public institution is very, very difficult.
Cyril, thank you for that. And I think You need
Sorry,
to
can I
start
have one
wrapping up
comment on
here.
that? Real quick, I'm sorry.
Charles, yeah, please.
I didn't have time to type in that I wanted to interject, but I think this is one of the big challenges we face because we looked at setting up a fund to focus on smart city solutions. And one of the partnerships that we signed up was with Singapore Management University because they have a degree program in smart cities. And the idea is just because a technology vendor can create a solution that works for a city doesn't mean it has the business, operational, or financial model that will actually work for that city. And they don't understand the requirements. So what we try to do is get a bunch of people who could actually sit in the middle and almost play, to try and understand the requirements of the city, the needs of the technology vendor, to try and create models that would actually work. And I think this is a critical thing because there's tons of solutions out there right now that could solve problems for cities. Those models aren't there. So find those universities that are actually focusing on it, leverage them and get people to play the middleman and try and create these models that will work for both parties. That's what we need to get the system going a little bit better. And I apologize again for interrupting you.
Just saying that,
No
we
problem.
at the moment at the lab, we're doing a lot of that, Charles. So I think it would be great to connect. And whoever is listening, we have currently an open call for submissions. So those who have the ideas but don't have yet the models or the financial solutions, we currently are looking for new submissions for our next lab cycle. So really would welcome whoever is interested in also reaching out to us and trying to hopefully share some of these ideas so we can make sure that we can, again, we're a research organization, so that we can help basically, design these models and the underlying financial structures with the investors with whom we are collaborating. And sorry, Nigel, for interjection here.
No problem. In fact, do you have the link to your incubator? That would be good if you can paste that in here.
I think I already did it, but I'll do that. I'll paste the link for the call for submissions as well in the chat box.
Brilliant. Okay, look, I'm just checking the time now. We have, in fact, we've just rolled on to half past the hour, so we need to draw this to a close. I just wanted to make a couple of observations on the main points made, and then I'll finish off by thanking our esteemed panelists. So I was trying to think of a way of summarizing the enormous amount of information that our panelists have raised, and the words that came to me all began with the letter C, and I've got the 5 C's of climate action in cities. So here we go. First one is coordination, and this draws straight from Barbara's opening remarks about this multi-stakeholder approach being absolutely critical, bringing together national, local, civil society. So this kind of coordination. We also talked about the capacity of people. I think Lisa mentioned the importance of capacity, skills, and then Cyril finished off with a really interesting comment about the culture of being very different between the cities and these startups. So this whole idea of capacity to understand one another. Cost reductions spoke to me because Charles's point about energy efficiency and the role of energy efficiency being absolutely critical. We have a deal at the moment in EBRD in Amman in Jordan. The city is absolutely on its knees financially, and the only thing that they're investing in is energy efficiency, because particularly energy efficient lighting, because they can see it has a direct impact on their bottom line. They can save money within a year. C number 4 is capital, and we've all talked about this, so access to finance. We've talked about concessionality, and we've talked about the City Gap Fund, providing access to capital, whether it's pre-project feasibility or the actual lending itself. And then the final C is C for change. There's been a lot of discussion about this innovation, and there's also been discussion about changes in thinking, whether it's at the level of EIB, thinking about how they are designing their buildings to remove car parking and increase cycling, or through to changing operations. EIB mentioned what they're doing with respect to Paris alignment, absolutely fundamental change that's going to be leading the way in the financial community, I think, and changing our thinking around the regulatory environment with city access to private capital. This is the point that Barbara made right at the beginning of our panel. Okay, so with that, please let me thank our panelists, Barbara Buchner, Global Managing Director for CPI, Charles Reed Anderson, founder of CRA and Associates, Lisa De Silva, Global Cities Lead at IFC, and Cyril Arnaud, Head of the GRAF at EIB. Thank you all for your participation, and thanks to all of our audience for your engagement. Thank you very much, and wish you a good rest of the day for those people on the west coast of the US, and evening for those joining us from India and further to the east. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Thanks, everyone.
Good, Nigel. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.